Hello, welcome to Techniques for Solving Converting Line Issues. I'm Steve Lange of ProcessDev LLC. In my 40-year career in the web converting industry, I've had to solve a number of issues related to quality, process reliability, waste and scrap, and throughput. So the talk today is going to talk about some examples of that and some ways that have been used to solve these issues by myself and others, with a particular focus on virtual experiments later in the talk. Just some examples of quality issues I've had to deal with. One was a film that suddenly started to show holes in the film in a particular part of the process where there had been none before. Another case was a laminated web that when it was cut would pucker and curl in multiple directions. We had a new material that was put on a line that had recently been sped up and now had suddenly telescoped on the unwind. One web had a very loose edge, a baggy edge, and it was being coated, so when that baggy edge approached the coating head, it wouldn't lay flat and the coating would skip. We had a new material. It was thinner, it had less uniform web properties, and it would wrinkle very easily. And so the wrinkles would grow, so much so that the wrinkles would fold over and draw in the web edges as it processed through the web path. And one web was almost unconvertible. You would cut this web and it would roll into a tube. And finally, one web, when unwound, the web width oscillated fairly dramatically through the unwinding roll. In terms of reliability and waste, certainly in web converting, missed splices are common, and the machine stops associated with that. Web breaks that happen during line ramp-ups and ramp-downs because of all the transients, or a web that mistracked or steered off of center line so badly that even a web guide couldn't correct its position and the line would shut down. Certain webs, the wound rolls were of such poor quality that the outer portions of the roll might have to be cut off or slabbed off in order to get to a part of the roll that was runnable, or on the other end, down near the core, the web was unrunnable. And then frequent negative interactions of webs with rollers where coatings or adhesives or fibers or dust would be deposited onto rolls, creating wrinkles and other issues. Throughput issues ranged from having a converting line that needed to be sped up because of increased demand, or because no more capital expense was affordable, so we had to get as much as we could out of the existing equipment. Other lines had to run many different products, so changeovers were frequent, new materials had to be loaded, and those changeovers would often create losses as the startup would have to be done for each new product and material set. Certainly, as operators have been aging and retirements have been increasing, then recruiting new operators has been an issue for many converters. And in terms of throughput, there's no bigger throughput issue than when there's a new product. It's so new that there's no converting machine on the market to make it, and so something has to be developed. And in some cases, those new machines, because they are new, they take longer than expected or predicted to start up because of issues with interactions or just new development. So what are some typical approaches to meeting challenges in converting processes? Let's take first the concept of physical experiments. Now, experiment might be a generous term in some cases. These tests that I would call guess and test or trial and error or one factor at a time, they usually involve just trying something, turning process setting, seeing what happens, see if something gets better, see if something gets worse, and try going through all the known settings that are available on the machine to try to make something better. This usually misses these interactions where one factor, the level of the factor itself, affects how another factor actually controls the process. Some people will use designed experiments. These are statistically designed experiments, and where you change multiple settings in multiple runs of the machine. You collect data from the outputs of interest, and then you build a statistical model, usually some sort of regression model relating the inputs to the outputs. And to build a good model, usually there's multiple types of experiments have to be run. First, you have to determine through screening which factors are even important, and then there can be things like response surface models that zero in on the most important factors to build the best predictive models. And then, of course, now with the advent of lower cost sensors and lower cost data storage, and the rise of algorithms in machine learning and artificial intelligence, now there's even more opportunity to build predictive models based on large amounts of data. Some more examples of physical experiments might be that you can learn at a very small scale on a bench top. If you can replicate the physics of some part of the process in a very small machine, then it can be very efficient to learn at that scale. Or if you need to understand how multiple unit operations interact, but maybe at a narrower web width or slower speeds, then pilot lines are sometimes used to replicate the process. If the equipment doesn't exist in-house, sometimes contract manufacturers may have relevant equipment you can run testing on. If you're trying to increase throughput, just want to understand what is the true limit of the current machine, then speed limit tests can be done just to turn up the speed and see what happens, see what gets worse, where are the weak parts of the process. And then a special type of experiment might be a robustness test. This is a style of designed experiment where you try to minimize the effect of uncontrolled factors like environmental factors or material variability to try to choose a set of process settings that make you insensitive to those uncontrolled factors. There are some obvious advantages of these type of experiments. If you're doing these experiments on the full production line, then all of the phenomena that are important are typically going to be there. They're included de facto, meaning you get the variation in materials, in the environment, in the operators running the process, and so you can tend to trust what you're going to get because it's replicating the full scale. And if you have a pilot line in conjunction with the full-scale line, you can do learning on the pilot line without interrupting the full-scale line. So that's an advantage in that case, provided that you know how to translate what you learn on the pilot line to the full scale, which is sometimes harder to do than it sounds. The idea of running the last experiment first, so that you can get to market quickly. If everything works out well, you might just succeed. And the learning curve for operators on that machine is completed. As soon as they learn how to run that process, they're ready to make production. But, of course, there are some disadvantages of these approaches. If you're doing it on a full-scale machine and you're doing testing and you can't sell the product, then obviously you're losing out on the sale of products from that machine, and you create some changeover losses when you go between tests and production, obviously. And then if you're using this machine to physically run and make product, then you need materials and you need people and you need spare parts. All of that requires investment to maintain those things as a good test bed. And they consume raw materials that may be wasted if you can't sell the products. And a key distinction people forget is that even testing on these full-scale machines tends to be in short bursts or for short durations if the product can't be sold, because it's costly. So you are still making a model of reality because you're only running for short periods of time. So you may not be replicating all the long-term effects that you may see in the process. And of course, if you're doing a very large machine with lots of process steps, then if there are any low performing parts of that process, they may delay the development of the entire process because you have to focus on those parts, and the other parts of the process may sit idle. Or they have to be run just to learn, and that costs more to do. Some other disadvantages: if you have a number of different projects, a number of different products competing for time on a machine, then it may stretch out the schedule for all of those projects as they compete for time on a limited asset. If you're doing work on pilot lines, they may lag the upgrades that a full production line may get, so they may lag the actual process you see in production and may not predict it very well. Or conversely, they get all the new things, and so that's great for the pilot line, but they may not replicate what you're going to have in production. So they tend to become less predictive over time. If you're making a new product for which there's no machine, obviously you have to design and build, install, and get it going before you can really learn on it. If you're doing these big data models, then you need sensors, you need to have them installed, you have to have the right skill of people, data engineers, data scientists, process engineers all working together to build this kind of thing up and get it to work where you get some output that makes sense and is useful. And of course, if it's a physical system, you can only test what's in the capability of that current system. You can only turn the knobs up as high as they go or as low as they can go with the equipment that's in place. So if you want to test something new, you're going to have to stop and install that and get it going before you can test it. Another alternative I call virtual experiments. And these are using models and simulations in place of physical testing. If you're not familiar with this, these are basically representations or models of a real-world system. I have a graphic on here showing an accumulator in a web line. So you use these virtual machines to study and predict the behavior of the machine. They're typically simplified. They may not have all the physics involved, but they test the most important parts of the process that involve you being able to control the process through the model simulation and learn. Some advantages of these types of virtual experiments: obviously you can do a lot of different iterations in a short amount of time. You're typically limited just by the number of analysts that can use the software, the number of computer workstations and software licenses, and limited by the time of the, an individual iteration. But it's not impinging on any physical system. Obviously, the material used is virtually none. You may have to do some testing on some physical raw materials to get model inputs, but that's very limited amount of material. So you might be able to take early samples of materials, get testing on it, and do simulation far before you can do it on a full-scale machine. And of course, you're not going to impact production if it's a virtual machine, a virtual production system, except if you need some inputs for your model that involve collecting data from the production machine. And like a physical asset, once you build one of these virtual machines and run experiments on it, you can run lots of different experiments for different purposes to answer different questions. Some other advantages: you're not dependent only on physical equipment that you already have. You can test new converting lines, web paths, new materials with different properties, tension or speed set points that are outside the current capabilities, and you can test some non-ideal conditions, say a stuck idler or a dancer that is not controlled properly. All these things can be done and explored virtually first. Data that can be collected from a simulation may be kinds of measurements that you can't even do in a physical world. It may be practically too expensive to, say, measure web tension in every web span, but you can do it in a model. And so certain outputs are easier to get perhaps in the model than in reality. You can use these experiments for training, for troubleshooting an existing process, for doing design reviews of a new machine, etc. Lots of different purposes. But they also have disadvantages. A statistician at the University of Wisconsin, George Box, has this quote attributed to him that all models are wrong, some are useful. And that's just another way of understanding that models are just that. They're idealizations. They may not include all the factors or all the physics. They may not be able to model every phenomenon or every type of equipment. And they take time and effort to build as well. They do require measurement of inputs for the models, for material properties and equipment that sometimes are not typically measured for ongoing production. And they require new skills and maybe new employees even to execute these types of experiments. So I'd like to give 3 examples of some virtual experiments related to web handling from my experience. These are using Maplesoft's web handling library for illustration. I mentioned earlier this case where I had holes that appeared in a film. This film was actually a textured film. It had bumps on it. And we discovered that the tops of the bumps were being sheared off, creating some holes. And they weren't present in the unwinding roll. So it didn't come in like that from the supplier. They appeared when we inspected the whole path to appear in one span of the web path. We discovered that the film was slipping on this roller. It had a very high surface roughness. It was abrading the film, and it was opening the holes. And the holes were undesired. So it turns out the slipping of a web on a roller can be predicted in a simulation. This equation, the capstan equation, also known as the band break equation, shows the ratio of tensions that you can have on a roller before you're going to have complete slip. And that ratio is proportional to E to the coefficient of friction times the wrap angle. And the equation on the right is used if the web itself is quite heavy, then you need to account for the mass and the centrifugal force in this equation. But it basically says if you can predict the tensions and you know the wrap angle and the coefficient of friction, you can determine if you're going to have slippage on a roller. In Maplesoft's web handling library, this is an example of a virtual experiment where we have a roller that has a fixed tension downstream pulling on the web. And in the experiment, the speed of this roller can be controlled so that it increases during the experiment. So it goes faster and faster. And what we're looking for is measuring the tension upstream, which is going to be increasing, versus downstream with the fixed tension. And at some point, that ratio of tensions will exceed that capstan limit, and the web will be in full slip. Here's an example of the output, and one output from the model, from the simulation. It's showing the tensions as a function of time. As the roll speed is increased, we see the tight side increase in tension, and the slack side stays the same because we have that as a fixed tension. So we're getting up to over 170 newtons on the tight side compared to 150 newtons on the slack side. So this is another output of the simulation. It's an animation showing the roller and the web on it. The roller will increase in speed, and you'll see that the tension on the upstream span goes up, denoted by a color change. You'll also see arrows start to appear on the surface of the roller, and at some point those arrows will cover the complete arc length of the roller, the complete wrap angle. That's showing that the slip zone has basically reached the capstan limit and the entire web is in slippage around the roller. So watch that upstream span, the color starts to change as the tension goes up, the arrows appear, and the web is in full slip. So you can use simulations like this to test wrap angles, coefficients of friction, different tensions, and sort of find out in advance where your web will be in traction and where it will be slipping. Another example was this laminated web. It was comprised of 3 layers. Each layer in the laminate had different properties with respect to modulus of elasticity. And when you cut this laminated web into discrete pieces, it would pucker and curl, mainly pucker. We were able to separate the layers and measure the length of a cut sample of each layer. And you could see that each layer was a different length. And that means that basically there was a different mass flow rate for each layer, and the strain at the combining point then, where they were joined together, was not the same. In MapleSim, you can do a lamination simulation. This is an example where we have 3 webs with 3 different modulus of elasticity. And in this case, the tension is controlled by brakes on each unwind. And in this initial simulation, the braking torque on each spindle is the same, but the web properties are different. So we're interested in the strain at that nip that comes right after the unwind. So the initial output of this simulation, as a function of time, the strain is plotted for each web. And you see at steady state, actually throughout the simulation, none of the webs have the same strain. Web 2 is the highest, Web 1 is the lowest, and Web 3 is in between. So the goal is to try to get rid of this puckering to deliver the same amount of strain to each web at the point of combining. So in this next simulation, we're going to reduce the braking torque on Web 2 and Web 3 to try to get them all to match up with Web 1. Now we see, after doing that change, we've gotten all 3 curves to lay on top of each other at steady state. And in the final analysis, the puckering went away because the lengths, the relaxed lengths of each web were the same. The next example, I talked about a web that had a lot of variation and was thinner and would wrinkle and fold over in a web path. One of the known solutions for trying to pull out slackness in a web is a concave roller. This is a roller that has a higher diameter at the edges than the center. The question is, how much diameter difference do you need and how much slackness can you get rid of? You don't want to have to build a lot of different rollers of different designs and test them all. So researchers determined one way of predicting the amount of spreading that you can get, or lateral slackness removal, from a concave roller. What they did is they used concave rollers and they put a slitter upstream of one and measured the slit separation of the two webs on a concave roller. And they hypothesized that the amount of spreading you would get then would be 2 times this amount of spreading that you get in the slit webs. And the factors that affect that amount of spreading involve things like the length of the span entering this type of roller, several web properties like thickness and modulus and width, as well as, of course, the shape of the roller. And in this case, they chose a parabolic shape of the roller, so there are 2 parameters, A0 and A1, that define that shape. So in a simulation, we can take that underlying math model and create an object that is a concave roller in the web path. And this is what it looks like in terms of the output. You had a basic unwind, 2 idlers, and a concave roller. And we're interested in predicting the amount of spreading. This plot on the left is the amount of spreading. You see it's not uniform. And that's because the basic equation showed that tension of the web affects how much spreading you get. So if we have tension dynamics, then that's captured in the simulation. We see that the steady state spreading is around 10 millimeters, but it can vary quite widely because this right-hand plot shows how the tension changes as this process starts up. So you can use this simulation to test different roller designs, different span lengths, different web tensions in order to get the desired amount of lateral slackness removal. The examples shown here were done after a problem occurred. By using simulation and virtual experiments before real ones, though, some issues can be predicted and prevented, or at least reduced. So these types of virtual experiments can save time, money, and reduce converting issues. But you don't have to stop there. You can combine these types of virtual experiments and simulations with data you collect from your production lines to create hybrid models or even digital twins, leveraging everything you know about the process. If you have questions about solving converting challenges or about this presentation, here's my contact information. I would be happy to respond. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a really thorough presentation, just running through so many different segments of the kind of things that get thrown our way, bring wrenches into the system as we go. Again, if you have any questions for Steve, please add them to the chat as we go along. And Steve, sometimes there's a lot of finger pointing. The root cause of the issue is kind of a process where you're of elimination. You're trying to work out, is this something that is related to the operations? Is this something that we can redesign to fix? But there's also another player at the table, which is sometimes the material supplier. How much work is often needed to kind of build a business case to say it's not our problem, this is certainly something that you should perhaps get your more consistency with your materials. Have you seen that come up in some of the organizations?
Yeah, I mean that's an age-old problem. You know, is it the material? Is it the machine? Or is it both? And yeah, at the beginning of the problem solving, it can be a lot of finger pointing, which isn't productive. So having tools like a good experiment, whether it's physical or virtual, to really sort out what is the root cause. Is it in the raw material? Is it in the machine? Is it in how they interact? That can really focus the team. And the more collaboration there is between a material supplier and the converter or the machine builder, that can really get everyone on the same page and solving the problem. And yes, I did spend many hours in our suppliers' production plants trying to help them with their own converting processes as well as um, our converting processes. But using tools that take out the emotion and get down to the engineering and the physics and the science is the best way to go, in my experience.
And there's very often we did have just a comment that sometimes the materials that are coming into the environment are newer technology. Some things like certainly in battery or in medical fields, they are kind of proprietary materials. They are things that haven't really been had a long time to try and iron out all the issues or kinks or wrinkles even. So in terms of developing those. It would usually be also important to partner perhaps with lab testing teams or sort of expand your kind of capabilities if you don't have that within your own research teams, right?
I mean, that's the good thing about web handling is that it scales in terms of, characterizing materials. And obviously webs span all the way from melt blown and tissue webs, which are very weak, all the way up to metal foils and metal webs, basically. And yet a lot of the math, still applies, but you do have to characterize the materials. You have to understand their machine direction properties, their cross machine direction properties, their thickness properties. But once you measure and have the capability of measuring those things, even without a model, you can discern this material's, properties are very different from this one. That tells you right away you're going to have a different design in the machine. And if you combine that with a physical model, a virtual simulation, then it doesn't matter if it's new. If you have enough material to get some properties, you can already start to virtually play with the material in advance. Too many times I've seen people go out and buy a commercial machine that was designed for a different material than what they were going to run through it, and then find out, oh my gosh, this isn't at all matched to what I need to convert.
So doing some of those early decision-making processes with maybe some simulation or modeling of some sort would certainly pay off in that investment, wouldn't it?
Make your mistakes on a small scale and your money on a large scale. Yes.